Hello and welcome back to Triple Crown Wargaming with me, the Duke, once again. And I just wanted to take some time today to talk about a particular formation. A formation which has gained a lot of interest over the past few weeks since the Old World's release, particularly for infantry, but I guess you could also use it for cavalry or any other type of unit. And that is, of course, what has colloquially been referred to as Linehammer. All rights reserved to Dr. Luke Blackseal, who I believe first coined the phrase. Now, there has been a lot of debate online about Linehammer, whether that's other YouTube videos made, Dr. Luke Blackseal himself making two, in fact, about Linehammer. Many Facebook posts which I have seen in Warhammer the Old World groups, and many comments on those posts as well. And I think generally there has been really two camps that I've seen in both the videos and the Facebook posts and their comments. And in one camp, it's just people think that this Linehammer formation is just too good. And let me be clear, if you haven't seen any of the Facebook posts, if you've not seen any of the other videos made about it, Linehammer refers to generally an infantry unit, but could be any unit type, but is a unit arrayed in a one deep formation, particularly a very long single line with only the front rank. And with the Old World's rules, being that in combat you make at least one attack with every model in the front rank. So if you have multiple attacks, you can make multiple attacks if you're in base contact, but everyone will get to make one attack that's in the front rank. So by maximising your width, your front rank, you are therefore maximising the number of attacks you get to make against anyone in combat. So yeah, generally there are two groups, like I was saying. One is where people just think this Linehammer formation is too good. Now, personally, I wouldn't say I'm in this group. I think in certain situations with particular models, particular units, it is very good and it makes generally infantry very good. But there is also the other camp which is more sort of looking at this as saying, well, actually, yes, it is very good, but it's just a new tactic. It's not an unintentional design, or if it is unintentional, then it's not so broken that it shouldn't be used, or it should be restricted or outright banned even at events. I would definitely put myself in more of the second group. I think it's a new tactic to use. Now, whether that's intentional on Games Workshop's part when they were writing the rules and they actually thought, did this actually occur to them? I'm not sure, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. But these two groups are obviously completely opposing each other. And you see that in all of the Facebook comments as well. My big argument, though, for this being a tactic rather than it being too good and it being broken and it should be banned and restricted, my argument is that without it, there are very, very few infantry units, particularly ranked up infantry units. Skirmishers get around this a lot because they have very good rules just for being a skirmisher, no matter what skirmish unit it is. But generally for ranked up infantry, there aren't really many units that I look at and want to take. Not in a traditional block anyway, and keeping them in that block as well. That's another crucial thing, but again, we'll get on to that. Go into more detail on that a little bit later. But generally infantry is very underpowered, certainly compared to what it was in 8th edition, where really infantry was king. It was one of, if not the best unit types generally. Certainly better than cavalry 99% of the time. Monstrous infantry, good monstrous infantry could give it a run for its money because of the sort of generic rules that monstrous infantry had. But generally, I would say infantry was king in 8th edition. And now, in the Old World, outside of either very specific units and combinations, perhaps, within those units, infantry really is a tax that you feel like you're paying a lot of the time. Certainly, that's how I've felt. If you look at Empire, their state troops, just don't really seem to do anything. And that goes for ranged infantry as well as melee infantry. They just don't do enough. So actually, is this, formation, this tactic of putting them in a wide line, what makes them good enough to take? Personally, I think that is a reason. I don't think it works for every unit of infantry. I don't think it works if you go excessively wide. So really, I'm thinking about 15 to 20 is probably the max that I'd go. 20 is probably the very maximum I would go. And actually, that 20 isn't just a number I've plucked out of thin air. That actually comes from sort of how far you can reform a unit that isn't starting in a line, but how far it can then reform into a line. So the crucial thing with reforming is, any manoeuvre, in fact, is that a single model can never move more than double its movement. So most infantry in the game is movement 4. If you're an elf, you're movement 5, but generally infantry is movement 4, or slower in some cases. It'll be roughly movement 4. If you are in a 5 wide by 4 deep block and you're on 25mm bases, you can just about reform into a 20 wide line with a single reform. It's very close. So even a 5 by 4 block on 30mm bases, I don't think we'll be able to do it. I don't think it can. The model that would have to go on the furthest sort of edge, I don't think it would be able to move far enough. And you could work it out with maths and Pythagoras' theorem, but I'm not going to get into that on a video because I'm sure that's not for everyone as much as it would be for me. But yeah, 25mm, you can just about do it on a 5 by 4 block. 30, I'm not sure. Deeper than that, you're not going to be able to go into a single line because you're going to have to go wider and you're not going to have the width. So that's why I think 20 really is the max I would go. And like I was saying before, it only really works for certain infantry. Like an Empire State Troop, okay, you might be getting 20, 25 even attacks if you start particularly wide, or even if you just start in the line. Okay, but even with halberds, you're only going to hit probably half the time at best. Wound maybe half the time, maybe 2/3 of the time. Toughness 3 is probably still the average toughness. But you're going to die in your droves, you're going to have no static combat res, which I think for a lot of infantry is what actually helps them out a lot, because the big downside to the line formation, or one of the big downsides, I should say, to the line formation in combat is that you are solely, almost entirely relying on dice for your combat res. Now, when you throw enough of them, you should, be able to work out those averages and roughly work out what you're going to have in terms of combat res. But, it's a dice game. And as I'm sure we are all very aware, the dice can spike, the dice can fall off a cliff. You could roll really bad, you could roll really well, your opponent could roll really well on their saves. So that potential to just not do enough wounds in terms of combat res to then beat, say, the static combat res of your opponent if they're in a more traditional block, that is something that you definitely need to be aware of, because as much as, you're unlikely to just break and flee, particularly if you're a reasonably large unit, sort of 20 models-ish, you're unlikely, it's not impossible, but it's unlikely, particularly with, Image-Wiring Presence, BSB rerolls, that sort of thing. But still very possible, and yeah, you might just fall back in good order, but then if you've charged in that line, you're then giving your opponent the chance to charge and get the benefits that come with that. And there's a lot of, backwards and forwards, as it were, physically and sort of in the rules of charging and being charged in combat. Sometimes you want to be charged, sometimes you want to do the charging. But I think not having the static combat res is a big issue for a lot of infantry units, because that's what they rely on. Now, sometimes that's not enough for them, so maybe that's what makes you think, actually, infantry just aren't worth taking. And I think a lot of people have looked at that, myself included to some extent, and say, well, I can really build up, particularly with Empire, I can really build up the static combat res. I've got banners that give me double the combat res for each of my ranks. I've got everyone's got a banner that just adds one to their combat res, the war banner. And yet, I still often find myself losing reasonably significantly combat with a quite large block of state troops. So that's why I think, let me be clear, I don't think, like I've said, Linehammer is for things like Empire State Troops. For me, it's for elite infantry. So it's for things like Warriors of Chaos or Chosen of Chaos. It's for Swordmasters. It's potentially for things like White Lions. Maybe Hammerers or Ironbreakers, perhaps. They could also work in that sort of role. I think where you've got... The issue with that, I suppose, though, is a lot of those units have multiple attacks. So the wider you are, the more models you're going to have that are losing out on that second attack. So maybe it's very, very peak if you're min-maxing Linehammer, as it were. You want to look for good, very good sort of base stat line, but one attack. So really, what massively screams that to me is the Warrior of Chaos. You can give him either a 4-up save, 4-up armor save in combat, just a hand weapon and a shield. He's got ensorcelled weapons, which I believe is -1 AP if you just use a hand weapon. He's strength 4 with that hand weapon, so probably winding on 3s. Or you go the other way, make him slightly less survivable but more killy, give him a halberd. You've got marks to incorporate into that as well. For me, that is the very, very best unit to put in this line formation. And I absolutely think people will do it. And to an extent, I think people should do it. Particularly with those sorts of units. Because otherwise, infantry are very, very underwhelming. Outside of some very niche scenarios or combinations of spells and special rules and items and things like that. One other thing that really, if you're in the camp at least of saying that Linehammer is too good, one thing that really can curtail Linehammer is terrain. Now, again, actually, this is quite a big sticking point for a lot of people that I've seen online and that I've interacted with and spoken to online as well about actually, does terrain affect Linehammer so much? Well, I think I'm going to look at this in two ways. The first way is if you start in the line. So that is you deploy your unit however wide you want to deploy them, but we're going to stick to about 20 models because I think any wider than that, and I think terrain is always going to be an issue, but we're going to stick with 20 models for these examples. But you start in a 20 wide line, okay? You are minimum 20 inches wide, bar a few millimeters, because 25 mil isn't exactly an inch, but you are 20 inches wide. You could be wider if you're on 30 mil bases. Now, a 20-inch gap between bits of impassable terrain should be almost non-existent when it comes to crossing the table. Of course, there are going to be bigger open areas of a gaming table. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I don't think in a, not necessarily competitive, although competitive games would be included in this, but in a fair but interesting board to play on. And by that, I don't mean, you know, identical mirrored scenery so that everyone has the same, always got hill in their deployment zone, always got a forest, you know, inside their deployment zone and has got another line of sight blocking thing slightly off to one side, for instance. I don't mean fair in that sense. I mean fair as in a reasonable spread of different types of terrain where the centre of the board isn't just empty. So you don't just get out of your deployment zone and there's just nothing there until you get to your opponent's deployment zone. I think tables should always have one or two at least pieces of terrain that are fully outside of either player's deployment zone. And that just makes the game more interesting, as well as, I think, helping with the balance of things like Linehammer, of things like perhaps skirmishers or single monsters, or single models, sorry, where you can, you know, hide a model out or a unit out of line of sight. of another unit so you can protect them from being charged, things like that. I think Battlefield shouldn't just be a big open field. And I think the vast majority of people would agree with me on that. And I think in those sort of scenarios, on those sort of battlefields, a 20-inch wide unit is going to struggle to get everywhere it wants to get to when it wants to get there, particularly now with the changes to charging and your charge distance. Obviously, charge distance has dropped generally across the board. I can't think of anything whose average charge has gone up from 8th edition. Infantry obviously taking the brunt of that. Instead of 2d6 plus their movement, it's the higher of 2d6 plus their movement. So really dropping off on their average charge range. But also taking into account that if you have to wheel, you have to pay for that wheel out of your charge distance. Now, the rulebook does state that if paying for that wheel would make you fail the charge, you don't have to do it. Which essentially means if I have my 20-inch long line and I draw 2 straight lines from the edges, the very outside edges of that unit, going directly forwards, then if a unit is within any part of the unit, enemy unit is within the area in between those 2 lines, I don't have to pay for a wheel because I could move straight forwards and still hit the unit. And then when I close the door, that close the door, or aligning to the enemy is the actual phrase in the old world. Close the door was 8th edition. But that aligning wheel is free. Don't have to pay for that. That's fine. However, if no part of the enemy unit is within those 2 straightforward lines on the edge of my unit, I have to wheel. I'm forced to wheel if I want to make that charge, which means I have to pay for that wheel. And it's not going to take much of, a distance outside of those lines when you're 20 inches long to mean actually that charge fails, because you might have to wheel 1 inch, 2 inches, and then I've only got to be probably 8 inches away, not, just over 8 inches away. And that's a physically impossible charge if you have to wheel 2 inches, going off, the average movement for infantry. So it really doesn't take much to severely limit what a Linehammer unit can actually charge. And that's without thinking about, well, actually, is terrain in the way? Are any of their units in the way? Things like that. That's just purely actually the distance it's going to take to wheel that unit round. And actually on a 20-inch wide line, a 2-inch wheel at the very outer edge really doesn't change the facing of the unit all that much. So it could, I think, quite feasibly be a 3, maybe 4-inch wheel, and suddenly you can be even closer, where if you wanted, you can charge that unit, but it can't charge you. Or, more likely, you can charge something else, and the Linehammer unit can't charge you. I think that's also something quite interesting. I don't think I've said it yet in the 18, 19 minutes or so. Also something quite interesting to keep in mind is that it's not just going to be this Linehammer unit. Now, it could be, generally, this Linehammer unit, if someone wanted to, could be 1,800 of their points. Add a character or 2 in there. It could quite easily, I suppose, be sort of, 1,800 of their points in their 2,000 point game, if they really wanted to do that. But at that point, I think it really does become almost impossible to seriously sort of maneuver that unit. It's not going to be possible for it to start in a block and then instantly reform into a line. It can get wider and wider as the turns go on, but then you're taking up turns just reforming, or you're doing it after combat, but that's your entire army. So I can work around that. I can focus all of my army, all of my different units, and all of my spells, etc., onto that one unit. So I don't really think that's the way you're going to see Linehammer. And let me be clear, I do think you're going to see it. Now, as much as I said before, I don't think it's a problem, I do think you're going to see it. And that's because I think it's a very good tactic. to use for infantry, like I said. But yeah, back to what I was saying about it not being the only thing. I think you're going to have one, maybe two of these sort of Linehammer formation units, likely in an army at the very most. And I don't think you'll see it all the time. I don't think you'll see it in every army. I don't even think you'll see it in every Warriors of Chaos army, as much as I think a Warrior of Chaos is the very best option for it. I think you will see it in some, and you will probably see it to an extent on the, I would say, like higher middle tables at competitive events. You may well see it on the very top tables. I think it's not going to be a formation that works for everyone. And I don't just mean that in terms of the models, I mean in terms of the person as well, because people play Warhammer differently. I play Warhammer very differently to the Oracle or the Chieftain, for example, who also plays, Warhammer very differently to the Lawmaster. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not saying one person plays it better than the other, or one person is better at Warhammer than the other. There's just different ways of playing Warhammer, and there certainly was in 8th edition, and I believe there are in the Old World as well. I believe there are multiple ways you can play the Old World very well. And I think Linehammer is one of those ways. But I wouldn't go as far yet. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I will be found to be wrong with, some more data, some more input in the future. But I don't believe it's, the very best and it's an unbeatable tactic, or it's a sort of one-trick pony for everyone to use that's going to elevate their game, and suddenly everyone's going to be, performing at the top end of tournaments. I don't think that's what Linehammer is going to do. What I think it's going to do is potentially become a sort of rock, paper, scissors dynamic with monster-mounted characters, particularly flying monster-mounted characters, and also potentially mass skirmishers. I've seen this spoken about a fair amount as well. This one I'm less convinced on being a necessarily great idea than Linehammer. But, perhaps I will hold my hands up and say I've not really seen or experienced enough of that type of game or that type of army to really give an opinion on it that I think is valuable. But, maybe in the future, maybe we'll start seeing those things. Maybe myself or one of the other guys will sort of do what I'm doing here for that sort of mass skirmisher, not mashed potato, mass skirmisher type of army, and sort of go through, the pros and cons as we see them. But yeah, that's sort of my general thoughts on Linehammer, on its good and its bad points, because I think there definitely are good and bad points. But I think if you're looking to get the very most out of it, then these would be my sort of top takeaway moments, or top takeaway tips, if you will. Don't start the game in a line. I think that's a trap. I think you want to reform into a line at one of the many opportunities you get of reforming. It's worth saying there are a lot. As much as you can't combat reform like you could in 8th edition, you can reform basically at any point after a combat phase, unless it's a draw. Particularly if you win, you can reform on any of the, outcomes. If you win a combat, you can, if you pass the leadership test anyway. But even if you lose, if you fall back in good order, which is, in my experience, I would say the most common outcome of losing a combat is probably falling back in good order. You can also reform when you rally automatically at the end of that fallback, which is very, very powerful, and a very powerful tactic, which I know Dr. Blackseal spoke about at quite a length in one of his Linehammer videos. But also, if you do win the combat, if your opponent does break and flee, when you catch them, or if you're just overrunning, if you've wiped them out in combat, thanks to the FAQ, you can also then take a leadership test to reform at the end of that as well. There's lots and lots of opportunities to reform, and I think that is when you should do it to really get the most out of Linehammer. I also think you need to be very considerate of your flanks and sort of the board around you, because yes, as much as a very wide unit is going to be reasonably hard to flank, simply because of its width. It's going to have a very wide front arc. If something can get into the flank, you're only going to get one attack and you've got very little static combat res. You are still close order, assuming you have the close order formation. You might still have a banner, but you're only going to get probably 1, maybe 2 attacks. Maybe for characters, then you might get a few more. Maybe that's something to think about as well. You want to, put a character in the unit, so if you do get flanked, he can then move to the flank and hopefully deal out a lot of damage. But I think the biggest thing overall, the biggest tip I can probably give anyone out there who's looking to use Linehammer is make sure you have the right unit for it. It's not for all infantry. And to be fair, it's not just for infantry. There might be cases where you want to do it with cavalry, for instance, or monstrous infantry, monstrous cavalry, whatever it might be. But I think when you move outside of infantry, you're much more likely to have multiple attacks, which means you're going to be losing a lot of attacks that you are paying points for. And you are going to be losing those on the extremities of your line, unless it's line versus line. Then maybe not. But I think that's why, going back to the first point, that's why reforming into a line is probably the best thing you can do. So I think I've said my piece there when it comes to Linehammer. All rights reserved, Dr. Luke Blackseal. Let me know what you think of Linehammer down below, if you think it's just a new tactic in the game, or whether you think it's maybe too good or just shouldn't be allowed in events or casual play, or if you're gonna house rule it in your own gaming communities or at your events, whatever it might be. Let me know your thoughts down below. Hopefully you've found this little chat helpful, interesting, useful in some way, fingers crossed, and you haven't just been listening to me thinking, what is this guy chatting about for the last half an hour? But thank you for joining me here on Triple Crown Wargaming. If you did like what you were listening to today, make sure you check out all of our other Old World and 8th edition videos if you're into that as well. We've got loads on here, and you can also check out all of the exclusive videos on triplecrownwargaming.com if you sign up as a Knight of the Realm. You get access to tons of exclusive videos and more videos every month. So thank you for joining me here today, and we will see you next time.
Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share. Then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
You alright?